Now, this one hits extremely close to home, and I am not even going to pretend that I can try and be balanced or unbiased on this one. Today, we're diving headfirst into the Victorian government's so-called Rapid Child Safety Review that was sparked by the gut-wrenching mess with the alleged pedophile Joshua Dale Brown. This review is meant to fix the gaping holes letting predators waltz into daycare like it's happy hour at the pub, but in my opinion, the government's response is like slapping a dodgy band-aid on a shark bite and calling it surgery. If you are new to the channel or haven't seen any of my previous streams on the matter, my daughter was one of the children affected by the actions of Joshua Dale Brown, the alleged pedophile and child sex offender that allegedly, and God do I hate having to say allegedly, given that there is allegedly video and or photo proof of his offending, that assaulted 8 small children between the ages of a few months up to 2 years of age, including by allegedly contaminating their food with his bodily fluids, resulting in hundreds of children having to be tested for syphilis, gonorrhea, and chlamydia. Given our daughter's proximity to Josh and her interaction with him during his time at the centre, our doctor actually ordered a full blood screen for a number of other STIs. At the moment, it is my understanding that the 70+ charges that Brown faces relate to the possession or creation of child abuse material and also to the kids that could actually be identified. However, it is also my understanding that there are some unidentified, and my wife and I, like so many other parents from that centre, may never actually know what took place that was not recorded. This is all public knowledge, as my wife and I have been very vocal about holding those responsible for enabling this to happen in the first place to be held to account and to be a voice for those that need it. It has also given me an avenue to vent my grief over this. I can only imagine what the families of the 8 confirmed kids are going through. But for me personally, it has affected our family, our work, how we interact with people, and I mean, hell, I don't trust anyone with our daughter's well-being except for my wife. I don't think I've slept a full night since this all came out, and on multiple occasions I've woken in a cold sweat and needing to check on my little girl who was sound asleep just down the hall. So when I see what I consider to be insincere apologies, read emails full of corporate ass covering, and then hear about a PR stunt made the state government look good, you would better believe that it makes my blood boil.
Good evening. Victoria's childcare shame has been laid bare in a damning report into the abuse scandal that's tonight calling for the entire system to be overhauled. Jacinta Allen has committed to implementing all 22 recommendations, but critics say that will be impossible.
The Rapid Child Safety Review into Early Childcare Education and Care, which for ease of use I'm going to call ECEC, both because that's what they use in the review, but also because that's a bloody mouthful, was commissioned by the Victorian government on July 2, 2025, following serious allegations of child sexual abuse in early childhood education and care settings in Melbourne. The review, led by former South Australian Premier Jay Weatherill and a former senior public servant Pam White, was prompted by the charges against Joshua Dale Brown, a 26-year-old former childcare worker from Point Cook. Brown was arrested in May of 2025 and faces over 70 offences, including sexual assault against 8 children, contaminating food with bodily fluids, and other child abuse-related crimes. Authorities at the time advised parents of around 1,200 children to test for infectious diseases due to the nature of some of the allegations. It's been a harrowing experience.
The Gleisters' 2-week wait for their little girl's test results finally ended today.
Oh, it was just a wave of relief. Even just sitting there waiting as he listed off the different diseases. Hundreds of families got that gut punch letter. Hey, your kid might have a treatable sexually transmitted disease, but there's no cause for alarm. It's just precautionary. We swear. Lady Overlaw'd and I initially got a text message, and I then found out the full details from the media, as by that stage, it was already plastered across the internet. But imagine being one of those families that found out on the news, or worse, heard about it, thought that they dodged a bullet, only to receive that letter in the mail. A fucking letter. Ours came in the post almost a week after all of this hit the news. He allegedly worked at up to 20 childcare centres across Melbourne suburbs and Geelong between 2017 and 2025, including Creative Garden Point Cook, where our daughter attended, and where the alleged offending took place that we know of. He also worked at Papilio Early Learning in Point Cook, Nido Early School in Werribee, and others. There's a full list of all of his employment history on the government website. If this is your first hearing about it, feel free to go and have a look. Despite there being 2 prior non-sexually related complaints about Brown's conduct that were reported to the Victoria's Reportable Conduct Scheme in 2023, His working with children check was never reassessed, showing that there are systemic failures in information sharing and risk assessment. He'd been fired twice by 2 other childcare centres for non-sexually related conduct in 2021, as well as another alleged further complaint from a parent at a third centre in July of 2021.
The 26-year-old alleged abuser was reported to authorities in 2023 for aggressive behaviour towards children, but his working with children's check was never revoked.
That's unforgivable. That's horrendous. There should have been a review of his working with children's check, and that hasn't occurred. And because of that, there are hundreds of families now that are going to be experiencing the same thing that we are.
Victoria Police extended their investigation, identifying 4 additional centres in mid-July 2025. The prosecutors indicated more charges were likely as evidence continued to be compiled. Brown's case remains before the courts with a February 26 hearing scheduled. You better frickin' believe I'm going to try and be there if I can. So, on July 2, when all of this became public, Jacinta Allen fronted the press saying that she'd commissioned a 6-week rapid review of the childcare sector, which conveniently excluded looking at the government's involvement in the sector, such as excluding scrutiny of the Quality Assessment and Regulation Division, which is the state's primary childcare regulator within the Department of Education, from the review. The review was focused on looking to the future and did not include auditing past government actions, decisions, or oversights in regulation or enforcement. Basically, in my opinion, they jumped over "we investigated ourselves and determined we did nothing wrong" and went straight to "we're not even going to investigate ourselves because we know we did nothing wrong." Well, given what's come out in the review, I'd say that what they did wrong should come back to bite them in the ass anyway, but I'll talk about that later. Former South Australian Premier Jay Weatherill, that ex-Labor Premier from South Australia who presided over their own child protection shit show back in 2018, I might add, was one of the 2 appointed to write the review. In my personal opinion, appointing Weatherill to lead the review raises serious questions about conflict, both for his party affiliation, the restricted terms of reference of the review, and given his involvement in South Australia's 2018 Royal Commission into child protection failures, where he was forced to apologise for systemic abuse issues in his own state during his time in power.
Jacinta Allen has been criticised for the decision to appoint a former Labor Premier to lead an urgent review into Victoria's childcare sector.
What a crock of shit.
Live to Victorian State political reporter Jessica Maggio. Jessica, what's been said about the decision?
Well, Ange, as you mentioned, there's been a fair bit of criticism about this choice, and that's simply because it is the former South Australian Premier Jay Weatherill. Now, he is recognisable for a number of reasons, but more infamously because he was forced to apologise after overseeing one of the state's most severe failings of child protection.
Again, in my own personal opinion, appointing a guy with that kind of baggage smacks of insiders looking after insiders. It's like handing an arsonist the fire extinguisher or asking one of the banks that caused the 2008 financial crisis to suggest reforms to prevent future economic meltdowns.
Now, this was between 2011 and 2015 after convicted pedophile Shannon McCool was found to have abused 7 children between the ages of just 18 months and 3 over a 3-year period. Now, he was cleared to work in the sector after an investigation into inappropriate behaviour with a toddler was ignored. It sparked a royal commission at the time. Now, the Victorian opposition, Brad Batten, says that he should be stood down from the role and Victorians simply won't be able to trust that he's the right person for the job. But the Premier, Jacinta Allen, this morning has come out to say that that's exactly why Jay Weatherill is the right person for the job.
I already knew I wasn't going to trust the review, but that was just the icing on the cake for me. There were many critics, but I think this one ex-post really well sums it up as a setup for a soft landing, with posts labelling it a cover-up by insiders. The review's terms of reference focused on immediate actions Victoria could take or to advocate nationally to enhance child safety in ECEC without interfering in ongoing police or regulatory probes. What a crock of shit.
The Allen government has revealed exactly how it plans to tackle a statewide review into the troubled childcare sector. The Premier ordered the review last week as pressure mounted on all governments to explain how Joshua Brown was able to slip through the system, working at 20 centres with a valid working with children's check. The review will identify the immediate actions the government can take to improve childcare safety settings, analyse the National Child Safety Reform Program and advise on ways to strengthen working with children's checks. They must also consider previous reviews. But it's what's not included that has the Shadow Education Minister fired up.
We need to make sure that the regulator has the power it needs to actually make sure children are safe in childcare. But this review cuts that out completely. A review to review previous reviews.
Over 6 weeks, the panel consulted experts, peak bodies, unions, providers, including Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, regulators from other sectors, and child and parents' rights groups. Everyone, it seems, but the parents affected from the sounds of it. So what exactly were the findings? A scathing indictment that'd make even the most staunch lefties spit their drink, or at least I would hope they would. It emphasised that early childhood care is essential for many families in a dual income economy. I mean, well, yeah, with how messed up the economy is at the moment, it's not as if many can afford to have a parent stay at home. And the vast majority of educators are dedicated professionals, not perpetrators. However, the incident exposed vulnerabilities exploited by predators. First off, the ECEC sector has ballooned like a business on steroids. 60% more long daycare spots since 2015, up to 2,049, mostly for-profit organisations chasing Commonwealth subsidies like pigs at a trough. For-profit centres were more likely to be rated as working towards the national quality standard, especially in quality area 2, which is child health and safety, when compared to non-profits. What the hell is that? In terms of staffing, turnover is through the roof. 41% staff turnover in for-profits nationally versus 27% for non-profits, with over 60% of Victorian staff having been at their current childcare centre for 3 years or less. And you know what? That tracks. At one point when little lady Overlaw'd was in daycare, it felt like we were getting an email advising an educator was leaving every other few weeks. So why the high turnover rates at for-profit centres? According to the review, it's shitty pay, casual gigs, and labour hire dodginess, all while the market model's geared for growth and not guarding children. Don't get me wrong, I'm not criticising capitalism here, but the review found that the market-driven model, which was heavily reliant on federal government subsidies, was criticised for prioritising expansion over quality and the safety of the children, as well as workforce stability. And can you really say that it's a market-driven model when they're reliant so heavily on Commonwealth funding? Ultimately, the overwhelming conclusion was that while this model persists, risks to children will remain as it prioritises profits over protection, leaving predators to exploit gaps like a fox in a henhouse. I mean, to be fair, imagine if we ran schools like Uber Eats, where the cheapest bidder wins and safety is an optional extra. But no, the Victorian government is so busy blowing our taxpayer money on unnecessary BS that half the recommendations coming out of this review seem to be about suggesting that the Victorian government hold out their hand and demand more money from the federal government.
Please, sir, I want some more.
The review alleges that regulatory changes stem from underfunding, with the federal government ceasing contributions to the childcare sector in 2018, even as the federal government subsidies have hit $14 billion in 2023 to 2024. The state regulator, Quality Assessment and Regulation Division within the Department of Education, is now conflicted as hell, given that the state's running their own centres and there are insufficient unannounced visits to centres. And what's worse is that it sounds like information isn't being shared between the Working with Children check scheme administered by the Department of Government Services, the Reportable Conduct scheme administered by the Commission for Children and Young People, and the Child Safe Standards, which has apparently hindered risk detection. The Working with Children scheme presumes suitability of an individual unless proven otherwise, limiting use of unsubstantiated allegations or complaints, while the Reportable Conduct scheme restricted sharing unsubstantiated allegations. So what was the result? Breadcrumbs of creepy behaviour getting missed, letting blokes like Brown allegedly slip through. Quite literally, sorry parents, pedophiles are sneaking into your children's classroom because our bloated government departments don't like to talk to each other or don't possibly want to hurt somebody's feelings based on an unsubstantiated allegation. I mean, it's my understanding that generally a Working with Children check review isn't triggered without criminal charges, convictions, findings of guilt, disciplinary actions, or other relevant orders. I mean, to be fair, there were 2 substantiated allegations against him, so I would kind of feel like that's disciplinary actions that should have triggered a review, but I'll get to that in a second. Now look, just quickly, if you made it this far, I kind of feel like I've already earned the like on the video. It's more important these days than you subscribing, but hey, feel free to do both if you want, or even leave a comment if you're feeling bold. From what I can ascertain, there was an opportunity for Joshua Brown's Working with Children check to be reviewed twice during his time at Creative Garden. Once in April 2023 and again in January 2024. In both instances, despite the complaints about his conduct being substantiated and his conduct being reported to the police and the Commission for Children and Young People and the Department of Education, the relevant authorities exercised their discretion not to investigate. His employment ended during the second internal investigation while he was suspended, when he resigned, and he then went to work at several more childcare centres until his arrest in May of 2025. As far as I'm concerned, it is my opinion that the children and families at each of those subsequent centres could have been spared the trauma and heartache of being involved in this, in being tested for sexually transmitted diseases, of wondering if their children's innocence has been stolen, if someone had done their goddamn job. He was fired from 2 separate centres for misconduct 2 years prior to the April 2023 investigation. He then had 2 substantiated allegations against him within the space of a year. I am personally a proponent of zero tolerance when kids are involved, and I believe he should have been out of the industry, having been fired for misconduct not once but twice in 2021. If someone had done their job at that point, in my opinion, he would not have been in a position to sexually offend against these kids. But even when it came to the substantiated complaints against him at Creative Garden, how the hell did someone meant to be looking out for the welfare of our children look at his track record and go, no, you know what? We don't need to look into this any further. The state government were told 3 years ago that the Working with Children check was fucked, and they did nothing.
The report highlighting similar warnings had been made in 2022.
These are delayed reforms. The Ombudsman has been highlighting the need for changes to the Working with Children's check system 3 years ago.
So let's have an actual look at the recommendations in the review. It made 22 recommendations split up across 3 parts. Jacinta Allen said that the Victorian government will adopt all 22 recommendations. And you know what? That's not hard when 15 of the recommendations seem to be about making requests for funding or calling for some form of action from the federal government without the Victorian government actually having to do anything. That's not action, that's passing the buck back to Canberra. How is that supposed to rebuild the trust of the parents?
Trust has just been horribly broken.
I trusted these people with my child's life, and now I can't even think about leaving her at school or in anyone else's care without some form of anxiety. This review and response feel like a PR exercise, full of tables and timelines that sound good on paper, but do nothing to heal the betrayal or prevent the next nightmare right now. We parents deserve better than committees and bureaucratic nonsense and calls for federal help. But let's actually break down the recommendations from the review. For starters, as I said before, 15 of the 22 recommendations don't actually require the Victorian government to actually do anything, or are partly or wholly dependent on cooperation from the other states or the federal government, either in the way of asking for money or for calling for changes to national laws. It feels like a lot of vague promises without teeth, especially when so much hinges on Canberra stepping up, which history shows they rarely do quickly. But here's a condensed version of the recommendations. Number 1, amend the national law to make children's safety, rights and best interests paramount in all early education decisions. I mean, that sounds basic, but it's almost fully federal dependent, so Victoria's just advocating, they're not actually acting. 2, push the federal government for a full rethink of the broken market-driven early education system, including a 10-year strategy and processes for high-quality providers to take over failing ones. Again, it's all talk until the feds take the lead, which could take forever. Number 3, call on the national ministers to set up a temporary early childhood reform commission with parent input. This requires federal coordination, meaning more committees, more bureaucracy, more red tape, instead of actually doing anything. Number 4, speeding up a national worker register for early childcare staff with powers to deregister risky people while making Victoria's state version compatible. I mean, that's mostly federal when you think about it for the national bit, though Victoria's supposedly pushing its own legislation sometime in October. I mean, at least they're doing something, I suppose. Number 5, update expectations for the ECEC regulator to force better recruitment, inductions, and child safety cultures at providers. Literally a note from the government to their own department telling them to do better. Number 6, beef up the Working with Children check to include unsubstantiated intel, quicker suspensions, mandatory training, better resourcing, and national harmonisation. My understanding is that they were told to do this 3 years ago by an independent ombudsman. Why the hell that was not implemented, they have no excuse for.
This man, Ron Marks, has been charged of child sex offences, and the government were told by the Ombudsman, they were told by the Commissioner for Children and Young People that offenders would slip through the cracks. They were told that Working with Children checks needed to be reviewed without having to wait for conviction, and yet they did not act. And that is why on this side of the House, we have 3 young mums in their 30s speaking here today, grieving for the 2,000 families that had to test their babies for STIs because Labor has failed to keep their children safe in childcare. We are here voicing the concerns of every young parent that has reached out to our officers to say, why didn't they act? If they knew, why didn't they change things 3 years ago?
We already know what needs to be done from a 2022 report that the government failed to act upon. Why are we kicking the can down the road?
Number 7, reform the reportable conduct scheme for better info sharing, even the unsubstantiated stuff, and to fund it properly. Again, why wasn't this done years ago when creeps like Brown were slipping through? Number 8, create a shared intelligence hub with AI for risk spotting and merge key schemes into one regulator like social services. Great. So now everything's going to get tied up in additional bureaucracy, and they're bringing AI into the equation as well. Number 9, set up an independent regulator outside the education department with new powers. Okay, if they consolidate the bureaucracy, it might help, but independence means nothing without it being properly funded and without giving them actual teeth. Number 10, ramp up unannounced inspections to at least once per year. I don't understand how this wasn't already in place. I gather some places were actually getting inspected once every few years with an annual announced inspection, giving the centres time to tidy up and put the skeletons in the closet, same as any tenant when the landlord drops by. And they're suggesting that it'll take 2 full years for them to start actually checking in unannounced once per year. What the hell is that? Number 11, review the regulators' capabilities for modern risks like complex for-profits while pushing the feds to probe shady legal structures. I'm not even sure I 100% understand what that one means. Was that just word vomit? Number 12, demand higher penalties under the national law for breaches. Again, this is fully federal government dependent. Jacinta really just has to pen a letter saying, we adopted this recommendation in order to comply with this. 13, fund the state regulator properly while begging the Commonwealth to chip in again. Victoria funds it in part, but the big ask is for the federal cash reinstatement. Number 14, a call for a national staffing review. Like 4 eyes rules, meaning that there's at least 2 adults in the room at all times who have eyes on each other at all times, and to make sure that there are tighter qualifications for staffing. Again, this is something that relies entirely on the federal government. It's not actually something for the Victorian government to do. Again, this is just asking the federal government to change the rules. They can implement their own things. They don't have to just ask and call for things from the federal government. Number 15, another example of them holding their hands out for more cash. Recommend that the Victorian government seek federal grants for building modifications to improve lines of sight in childcare centres. Again, asking for more money from Canberra. Number 16, propose a national closed-circuit TV trial in early education settings.
The report stopped short of calling for compulsory CCTV cameras in childcare centres, instead recommending a national trial. That will be on the agenda when state, territory and federal ministers meet this Friday, but the Victorian Premier has already said she's happy to go it alone.
On CCTV, if there's not national movement, we will look at what we can do here in Victoria to undertake that trial.
But if they were to propose a national trial, that's going to require federal coordination with all the other states.
How do we ensure that those images are kept safe and don't fall into the wrong hands? Just saying, tick, we've got CCTV is not going to be the answer.
There are some core questions that need to be answered, but we're absolutely interested in those questions because the police have told us that CCTV would be a deterrent.
Number 17 is about making it easier for parents to access information about service quality ratings. Basically calling on the federal government to improve information for parents about services and compliance on their Starting Blocks website. What even is that? I'd never actually heard about it prior to this. And also to call for the national law to require services to display on their website and inform families about their own quality ratings. Basically making sure that parents have information about the centre's Yelp review. Number 18, create parent guides on safety signs and grooming complaints. Something that they can actually action, but I mean, this is just advice to be provided to parents. It's not systemic change. It's a fact sheet to give to parents, which, you know what? I'm all for helping parents being able to recognize the signs, but that's a reactionary measure. It shouldn't be up to the parents to determine if their kids are being groomed or abused when there should be things in place to keep the pedophiles out of the centres to begin with. Number 19 is basically calling on the federal government to crack down on crappy training providers. Again, it's another letter or a meeting asking for the federal government to do something, but beyond that, it doesn't really require the Victorian government to actually do anything. Recommendation number 20 is to push to fast-track the national mandatory safety training with federal funding for staff time requiring national law changes and cash from the government. Big surprise there, recommending that the Victorian government ask for more money and to make changes at a national level. Something that they can't be held to if the Commonwealth doesn't agree. Number 21, expand the state safety program with Early Childhood Australia while pushing for federally funded national quality improvements. Apparently that's supposed to be like a half state partnership, but half asking for stuff from the federal government. I don't know. And the last one, number 22, which frankly, as far as I'm concerned, should have already been in place and should have been obvious. Give early child care workers the confidence to raise concerns by providing training on how they can speak up and anonymously report to regulators. How the hell that isn't already ingrained in carers as part of their childcare education, I have no idea. If it is already, then this is just to make the government look like they're actually doing something again. But you see what I mean? Over half of these recommendations are just Victoria calling for or advocating to the federal government, some with timelines stretching 10 years, or a vague ongoing funding plea. We've been told that this is urgent, but without federal muscle, this is window dressing, leaving kids vulnerable while politicians pat themselves on the back. I mean, when it was released on August 20, 5 days after being handed to the government, so that they had time to prepare their response rather than being caught on the hop, I suppose, the review drew immediate responses. Premier Jacinta Allen apologised to the affected families.
To every family who has been hurt, I am truly sorry.
Apology not accepted, by the way, and committed to all recommendations, including establishing an independent early child care regulator by the end of the year, doubling compliance checks to annual visits, why they weren't annual anyway, overhauling working with children's checks, and the reportable conduct scheme into the social services regulator, with new powers for unsubstantiated info and suspensions, and creating a shared intelligence capability. The government says that they will advocate nationally for reforms like the National Register, the higher penalties, the staffing reviews, the CCTV footage trial, and to reinstate funding. However, critics have obviously highlighted the delays, with opposition leader Brad Batten accusing Labor of reviewing a review. You know, despite there being a 2022 warning on the Working with Children check weakness, and the Liberal Party previously introducing a bill to overhaul the system that Labor immediately voted against and killed.
So Jess, really sad day, what's just happened?
The government just voted down our bill to strengthen the Working with Children's check system here in Victoria. 3 years ago, the Victorian Ombudsman told the government that they needed to strengthen the system, that they needed to make sure it was actually protecting children, but they failed to do so. We brought those changes to the floor of Parliament today and said, work with us constructively to the government, but they said politics is more important and voted it down.
Overall, the findings of the review underscored a decade of unmanaged growth, prioritising market incentives over safeguarding our kids, with Victoria pushing for national fixes amid the ongoing investigation into Josh Brown's conduct. I mean, legislation is supposed to be introduced in the next week or so for them to start implementing some of these things. But in my personal opinion, it's all smoke and mirrors while the for-profits are raking it in, and parents are wondering if dropping their kids off is safe or a gamble. To me, this review is nothing more than a list of the things wrong with the childcare sector that the government can point at and say, yeah, you know what, we'll fix that. Eventually. When the Premier announced this review back in July 25 after the allegations came out, I didn't expect much from the Victorian government, but I clung to some hope that it would force immediate real change to protect our kids, help the families affected, and hold the system accountable for failing us so badly. But instead, it feels like a bunch of bureaucratic hand-wringing and finger-pointing that kicks the can either down the road or back to Canberra. The review dances around the actual horrors that happened without digging into why predators like Brown could bounce around 23 different childcare centres over a number of years, even after being sacked from one in 2021 for not meeting expectations during his probation period and getting a slap on the wrist for allegedly recklessly dropping a baby. It talks big about overhauling the Working with Children system to consider unsubstantiated allegations and allow quicker suspensions, but why was that not in place already? The Victorian government was advised to do that 3 years ago. Could making those changes have prevented what has happened? Or at least made it more likely for Brown to be caught prior to his most serious offending? In my eyes, how is failing to act on that not negligent on the government's part? We need real teeth. Deregister the creeps nationally, fund watchdogs properly, and ditch the lefty bureaucracy that has let this rot fester. But no, we're stuck with half-assed patches and bullshit band-aids. And look, the childcare sector's full of legends, educators that actually give a shit about these kids and are busting their guts for bugger all pay. But what are they supposed to do when even when they do the right thing and report something suspicious, the people responsible for investigating it look the other way and say, nope, nothing to see here? As a parent of a child who attended Creative Garden Point Cook, the place where Joshua Brown is accused of assaulting multiple innocent young children, I am personally heartbroken and enraged by this review and the Victorian government's inadequate response. Ultimately, the so-called overhaul is, in my personal opinion, nothing more than rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Far too little and tragically far too late for the families left with scars that will never Heal.
Nothing is more important to me as Premier than keeping children safe.
That is an actual joke.